I have a really exciting project to work on right now, and I want to share it with you. So I'm back on the dagger train. I'm making another dagger. Now this one is very different than the previous daggers that I've done. It's a main gauche, left hand dagger. Main gauche is French for left hand. And this was a dagger that was used in the Renaissance, basically as a dueling weapon. So your primary dueling weapon would have been the rapier. And in the rapier duel, you'd have your rapier in your right hand, or your main droit, and you'd have another dagger in your left hand. That would be your main gauche. And so these two weapons were used in combination in dueling. I've done some daggers of that fall into that category before, but this one's a little bit different. This one has a full shell guard that goes around the hand, and this is not something that I've done before. We're kind of flying blind here in terms of the way to construct such a piece and even the way to design it. So basically, right now, we're at the design phase of the process. So I've had some back and forth correspondence with the client who's commissioning this piece, and I've done a sketch. Well, I've done a number of different sketches to try to come up with the proportions that I want for the piece and kind of generally decide how the piece is going to be shaped. But now what I need to do is I need to take this sketch and I need to realize it on an actual scale. So I had these little thumbnail sketches that are itty bitty. So I need to figure out how long the blade's going to be, how long the handle's going to be, how long the guard's going to be, kind of the general proportions and size of the whole thing. And then I need to make a mock-up that I can photograph for the client. Now this is not going to be, the mock-up is not going to be anything pretty. It's just going to be something to generally show the ideas and the size before I make the whole thing in steel. So let's get to drawing, and then hopefully the mock-up will just kind of flow organically from there. I like to construct the proportions of many of my designs using a straight edge and a compass. Before the widespread adoption of standardized units of measurement, these types of techniques were used to construct everything from furniture to the largest cathedrals. I learned many of the basic constructions with a compass and straight edge in high school geometry class, but I learned how to apply them to sword and dagger design from Peter Johnson, who has analyzed hundreds of historical swords and daggers using these same techniques. I like to use geometry to make the dagger look as if it's in harmony with itself. Each component of the dagger relates to all the other components in whole number ratios. So the guard is twice as wide as the handle is long, and the handle is 1/3 of the length of the blade. Once I'm satisfied with the drawing, I transfer it to a piece of scrap wood to make a three-dimensional model. Making a model helps me get a sense for the feel and scale of a piece before I actually make it. And it can also be a good opportunity to practice shaping some of the more challenging components. The shell guard that this project calls for is by far the most intimidating and complex portion of the dagger. I decided to use heavy iron wire to model the outer basket portion around the shell, and for the shell itself, I decided to use brass sheet. In the finished dagger, the shell will be steel, but the brass allows me a slightly more forgiving material to work out some of the techniques I'm going to use to shape it. And here's the finished model. It's crude, but it's effective at conveying the form. You can imagine the rapier in this hand. But yeah, I think that's going to do nicely. Let's go make it in steel. The client requested feather pattern Damascus for the blade, and this is my first time making that pattern. So I'm starting by stacking up 15N20 and 80 CRV2 steels in alternating layers. I'm going to fuse all these layers together in the forge, but I have to tack the ends with a stick welder first to hold them together while they heat up. The forge heats the steel to around 22 or 2300 degrees Fahrenheit, and then the pressure of the power hammer fuses all those layers into one solid bar of steel. Once the billet is welded, then I draw it out lengthwise under the power hammer to make it longer and skinnier, so that I can cut it into pieces, and then restack it and do the same process over again. As I restack this billet, I'm adding additional pieces of 15N20 and 80 CRV2 to add some variation in the pattern density, which will make the pattern more interesting. This extra tall stack of steel barely fit in my forge, and then it barely fit under my power hammer. But I did manage to weld it, and then I drew it out to length. All in all, I restacked, forge welded, and drew out the bar 7 times to get the pattern density that I was looking for. Whenever I'm drawing out a Damascus billet, I make sure to draw it out flat and parallel, and I always measure to check it. And when I cut it into pieces, I make sure to label each one. That way when I put them back together, I know exactly which way to orient each piece. In order to make feather pattern Damascus, you have to split a billet of steel with a dull wedge at a high temperature. Most bladesmiths use a hydraulic press for this operation, which I don't have, which incidentally is also the reason that I haven't tried this pattern in over 10 years of making Damascus. Ultimately, I used 3 different height wedges underneath my little power hammer, and then finished the split by hand. If you look closely, you can see how the wedge drags the layers down in what will become the center of the feather. Then I re-squared and flattened both halves of the billet in preparation for welding them back together. Clean surfaces are paramount when forge welding, so I let these 2 halves cool and ground any forge scale off of the mating surfaces. Then I tacked them together again with a welder and put them in the forge for the final welding heat. So I ground off all of the surfaces of the bar, so now I can really see the clean steel. There's one little weld flaw there, but I'm gonna cut that off. So now I just need to figure out how much of this bar I need to forge into my blade. I can't just take off some of the length because then I'll lose some of the feather. So what I need to do is cut off this direction, basically a 1/2 inch. And now it's time to forge the blade. I start by tapering the bar to a point. I need to be extra careful to keep the bar from twisting as I hammer, otherwise the pattern in the final blade will be asymmetrical. I forge the taper with the hand hammer, and then I flatten it with the wide flat dies of the power hammer. Once the taper of the blade is established, I isolate the portion that will become the tang of the dagger using a guillotine tool. Then I draw that tang out under the power hammer and then finish it by hand. Once the blade is forged to shape, it's time to heat treat it. I harden the blade by heating it at 1475 degrees in my heat treating kiln and quenching it in oil. Once the blade is fully cooled down, then I'll put it in the oven again at 425 degrees for a tempering operation. And then it's time to grind the blade. All right, well, I did a little test etch, so you can just peek at the feather pattern in the steel there. And so now I'm going to position this on my drawing to see how it's going to look. Because the profile of this dagger is symmetrical, I want to draw a center line as a reference to help me as I shape the blade. Well, I got the blade all profiled. Both the blade and the tang are both symmetrical around the center line that I drew. Now, the next step that I'm going to do is put a piece of threaded rod on the end of the tang. So I'm going to make this dagger a takedown dagger, meaning that you can take it all apart. Not a very traditional way to construct a dagger. It's not really useful to have a pommel that screws on if you're in a duel, but it's really helpful for a modern day piece that is really mostly an art piece. If it gets damaged or scratched or something like that, I can take it apart in order to maintain it, in order to refinish it or retouch it. And so it makes it a lot more serviceable than something that's hammered together. So that's why I'm going to add the piece of threaded rod to the tang. And I'm going to do that with a process called silver brazing, also sometimes called silver soldering, but it's technically a brazing joint because it has a higher temperature. And it's a very strong way to connect the two pieces of steel. I'm going to make a slot in the tang to put the threaded rod into, and then I'll braze the rod into that slot, and that should make a really strong transition that is hopefully exactly in line so that I can assemble the whole dagger. Before I cut the notch in the tang, I need to anneal it to make sure that the files and bandsaw will cut it. Properly annealed steel cuts smoothly and easily. There are a number of reasons why I prefer silver brazing to welding for attaching threads to a tang. Not only is it easier to redo if I mess something up, it also helps to avoid the issues of grain growth and warpage, which are both very common in welding, which would leave the tang misaligned and or brittle. Plus, it's just satisfying to watch the silver brazing wire melt and flow into the joint. After a little cleanup, you can see that the silver has fully penetrated the joint and even filled in many of the threads. And now it's time to grind the bevels. All right, the dagger is ground, bevels are ground, it is oh so pointy, ouch. So now what it needs is a little bit more something, je ne sais quoi. I'm gonna add a little bit of file work. I think that's gonna help kind of embellish this dagger so that the blade will match the super elaborate handle that I have planned. The thumb well is a feature found on most historical daggers of this type, so I wanted to make sure to add one to this dagger as well. This little imprint indicates exactly where to place the thumb while dueling, but it also makes for an attractive embellishment in its own right. Now the blade is fully shaped and ready for sanding, but before I polish it, I want to etch my logo into the front side of the ricasso. And now it's time to sand the blade. I'm using 400 grit sandpaper to pick up where I left off polishing on the grinder. Once all the grinder scratches have been removed and replaced with finer sandpaper scratches, then it's time to etch the blade to reveal the Damascus pattern. That's one of the coolest sounds there is. I etched the blade in a ferric chloride solution, which reacts differently with the two different steels, so the 15N20 stays shiny and the 80CRV2 darkens. After a while in the acid, then I'll take it off and clean it with a high grit sandpaper. Once the etch is deep enough, then I'll neutralize the blade, dry it off, and oil it. So here I have the finally etched blade, and it's now ready for guard and handle. I always go back and forth on whether I like to finish these blades completely before doing the handle, because there's always a risk of scratching it, but I'm going to be extra careful to keep it in good shape, and hopefully it will not get damaged in the rest of the process. Essentially, the guard is going to be a piece that fits up onto the blade, and then there are going to be these other pieces that kind of loop around, and I want to forge those all out of one piece of steel. So I think I'm going to be able to split off sections partially and then forge them out and hopefully forge them a little bit to shape. I spent a lot of my career doing new things that I've never done before, just trying them out for the first time and learning by trial and error. And my sense is that this is probably going to take 2 to 3 tries to get the guard just right. Here's my first attempt at forging this piece. And I mostly got the shapes, but I'm deciding that I'm going to change gears a little bit and do a different technique, because cleaning up all of these interior areas is going to be a real hassle. The next attempt that I'm going to make is going to be to have all of these pieces each be individual pieces that I weld together. So my understanding is that the historical daggers of this type were assembled in a variety of ways. Some were probably forge welded, some were brazed, some were riveted together. And I think that for my purposes and for the purposes of this piece, I want to weld them together. I don't want to braze them because then we're going to see lines when I blacken the whole thing. Most of the historical ones weren't blackened, so it may have been less of a concern. But I want to make it all look like one uniform piece of steel, and for that, I think welding it together is going to be the best option. The finial balls I forged on the ends of this guard are kind of humorously large, so they need to be ground down quite a bit. But so far, this forging seems like it's going to work. I have material everywhere I need it, and I can always remove a little bit of material to get down to the shape that I'm looking for. I do all of the initial shaping on the grinder because it's quick and efficient at removing material. But then I switch to hand files for the finer precision work. Now that the keons, or the long portions of the guard, are shaped and sanded, I'm adding file work. The file work pattern is a twist pattern, but just like historical examples from the Renaissance, the twist pattern is actually filed in rather than twisted. The differences are subtle, but the termination of the flutes will look different on a filed twist than on a twisted twist, and a filed twist tends to be much more precise. Alright, so I've done all of the file work on this guard. Now I'm just about ready to weld on the pieces that will form this shell. And I've got this stock that I hammered out. It was 1/4 inch round stock, and I made it just a little bit smaller under the power hammer and sanded it. So I should be able to gas weld them right side by side, right to this guard, and then bend them around. I decided to use my oxyacetylene torch to weld the guard components together, because it gives me a lot more control than my stick welder would. I'm welding the pieces from both sides to ensure that the weld penetrates all the way through the steel to make it one solid piece. I hope you know how much courage it takes to show one's welds on YouTube, but you can see here I stuck the pieces together. There's little porosity there where I picked up the torch, so I might go and try to close that one up, and should be ready to go on to the next step. So that next step is fitting the guard to the blade, and I need to be extra careful to fit it such that it's aligned and centered on the blade. Otherwise, I'll have to mess with the file work that I carefully did. I'm going to make the guard slot the low-tech way by making center punch marks, drilling on the punch marks, and then sawing out the webbing in between with a jeweler's saw. In hindsight, I probably could have done this on my milling machine with a couple of extra fixtures in order to hold the guard. This manual method takes a little bit more time, but it leaves a fine result if you've got some practice filing. So now that I've got this guard all fit up, before I bend these arms around into the basket, I'm going to make the spacer and fit the handle and fit the pommel so that I know exactly where the basket needs to curve around. For the spacer, I am going to use my milling machine, so after removing the bulk of the metal with a drill bit, I switch to an end mill and cut the slot as precisely as I can. The end mill makes the slot the right width, but I still need to use the file in order to square up the corners and make sure that the slot matches the taper of the tang. Once that piece is fit, it's time to start on the pommel. Because of its round shape and because of the takedown construction of this dagger, I can shape the pommel almost entirely on the lathe. First I have to drill and tap the pommel so that it'll thread onto the dagger. The tap cuts a female thread in the pommel, essentially making the pommel into a nut that holds the whole dagger together. Once the pommel is drilled and tapped, then I can start to give it its shape. As you can see, I can't fully shape the pommel while it's still attached to the parent bar, so I'm going to cut it off with a bandsaw and then turn it around and put it on the lathe the other direction. I had to make a special threaded mandrel to hold the pommel on the lathe, as there was nowhere else on the part to clamp it accurately. Now the pommel is fully shaped, and let's see how it fits on the dagger. Looks good to me. Now it's time to shape the spacer. Alright, so after a little bit of lathe work and a little bit of file work, I've now got the pommel and the spacer pretty much done to their finished shape. I might do a little bit more polishing on the pommel, but that's easy to do at this point. So I still need to do the handle, but I'm still waiting for the block of wood to arrive for the handle. So in the meantime, I'm going to start working on this basket portion of the dagger. But I'm pretty pleased with the pommel and spacer so far, and it feels nice to have a couple of polished, finished pieces on the dagger. Good for building morale as we go toward this new and uncharted territory. So I did some rough cleanup on this piece just to get it close to shape, but because I'm going to weld it once more, I'm not going to bother making it perfect. And essentially, that piece is going to go right there in that basket. And these arms are going to come around and connect eventually, but I'm going to do that after I have the rest of it in place, and I think that'll make it easier, hopefully. Now that all of the bars for the guard have been welded together, a few hours of straightening heats and minor adjustments help to get everything symmetrical, and then I'll be ready to make the shell portion. I'm making the shell from 16 gauge mild steel, which is thick enough that once I've formed it, I'll be able to file and polish the top side of it without compromising the protective capabilities or the integrity of the guard. After cutting out the shape with the jeweler's saw, I raise the general form using a hand hammer and a variety of different stakes to support it from the backside. Once I've shaped the shell as closely as I can using these raising techniques, then I'll anneal the shell and put it in a pitch bowl so that I can chase in the smaller details with punches. This red German pitch is derived from tree sap mixed with other ingredients, and it'll support the back of my shape as I work on the top of it and keep it from collapsing under the force of the hammer. I use a variety of differently shaped punches to form the shell, working over the entire surface several times to define the shape. The final tool I use is a small rounded punch in my engraving handpiece. The rapid hits of this tiny pneumatic hammer help me even out the form and smooth the surface much faster than I'd be able to by hand. Let's see how the shell fits on the guard. Boy, is that going to be pretty. I need to clean up all the welds and transitions in the bars that surround the shell before I put the shell on, because as soon as that shell is welded in place, those little nooks and crannies will be very difficult to access. I found that thrumming with a piece of a sanding belt was the most effective way to clean up and polish the basket of the guard. Time for a nerve-wracking operation. So I've polished this whole basket assembly basically as much as I think that I need to in order to attach the shell. I wanted to do a lot of polishing on it before welding the shell on, because the shell is going to kind of restrict my access to some of these inside bars and that sort of thing. So I wanted to get it as polished as possible, but obviously I didn't want to go too overboard, because as I'm welding, the heat's gonna spread a little bit. I might get some scale in some areas. I'm gonna have to repolish and kind of dress the welds after I weld them anyway. But I think it's at a good stage. So there's not much more for it at this point but to just do the weld. I am optimistic that it should be okay. I've done a couple of little test pieces, but not on anything that I've spent quite so much time as these. I mean, I think I've spent close to a week of work just making the shell and the basket assembly at this point. And so welding these two kind of thin and also different thickness pieces together is a rather risky operation, because it's easy to burn through the shell or that sort of thing. So I'm going to be extra careful. So now it's welded all together. Just got to clean it up with a file and some rotary tools and sand it all. Just a few dozen more hours work. Though I actually quite like the hammer texture on the outside of the shell, the plan is to embellish it further with gold koftgari along the ridges, and in order to add the koftgari, I need the surface to be smooth. So I'm going to polish out all the hammer marks, first with files, and then with sandpaper and stones. folks, it's handle time. Here's the piece of ash-burl that I'm planning to use. Really stunning piece of wood. And just got to cut off the right length. The bottom section of the handle, where it meets the pommel, is round in cross-section. So I'm going to make the entire block into a round dowel. And then I'll chuck it up in the lathe to turn the bottom half of the handle. I designed the end of the handle to extend slightly into the hollow portion of the pommel, which will significantly increase the strength of this critical connection, and it will also help the two pieces align perfectly every time I put it together. My plan for this handle is to incorporate a spiral reeding pattern with twisted silver wire in between the reeds. Here I'm very carefully laying out a grid on the handle, which will allow me to ensure that the reeds spiral up the handle at a consistent rate and are evenly spaced. Here you can see the reeding really starting to take shape. I sculpted the initial surface with a file, and now I'm using a specially shaped sanding block made to match the dome of the reeds, to even out the curvature and to smooth and polish the wood. And then it's time to prepare the handle for the silver wire inlay. Well, we're really closing in on this dagger at this point. So I've gotten the handle with all of its reeding in place, and the last thing that I'll have to do with the handle is install the twisted wire. I want to wait for another couple of days for the tung oil to cure and to give a proper polish on this handle before I install the wire permanently. So still waiting on that part. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for the handle to cure, it's going to be time to do koftgari. Koftgari is a technique that's been used in India and the Middle East and Persia and throughout Turkey for a number of centuries. It's a technique for applying gold wire onto an iron surface, and I learned it from some master craftsmen in India, Rahul and Sandeep Singh Chauhan, among others, and I now do it in a lot of my other work. So you can see a couple of other videos that I've made that involve this, certainly a lot of my short videos, and also the Chinese cleaver that I put koftgari on just a few months ago. And I'm going to use the same technique here with a slightly different pattern to embellish this Main Gauche dagger. Very careful surface preparation is key to the koftgari technique. I score the entire surface in 2 directions with a knife, and that creates a series of very small hooks, and that surface will allow me to press very fine gold wire onto the steel in whatever design I choose. The surface preparation itself takes several hours, and heavily curved surfaces, such as this pommel, are even more challenging. Here's the fully cross-hatched pommel. It's nearly ready for gold wire, but first I have to heat it one more time. Heating the steel turns it blue, which creates a helpful visual contrast as I apply the gold wire, and it also burns away any residual oils that might be on the surface. Once the pommel is cooled back down, I apply the gold designs, firmly pressing one wire at a time onto the cross-hatched steel, with a steel tool made specifically for this purpose. Once all the design work is complete, I heat the piece one more time and burnish it with a polished piece of agate stone. The burnishing locks the soft gold into place on the little hooks created by the cross-hatching so that it's permanently affixed. And now I'll complete the same process with the other components of the dagger hilt. Pieces like this are incredibly awkward to do koftgari on because you really need room for both hands over the surface, and right now the shell and this keyon are getting in the way of where I can put my hands, so it really limits the way that I can access it. Plus, I need a way to hold it, and that means that I need to have the vise there as well. So between the vise and the rest of the piece, there's like almost no room to put my hands. The underside of this might be not quite as neat looking as the top side, but that is just kind of par for the course. And luckily it's the underside. The outside is a little bit easier to access, and so it'll look a little prettier.
In my opinion, gold koftgari looks best against a black background, as the high contrast really elevates the design. And my favorite way to blacken the steel is with a process called salt bluing, in which a boiling solution of sodium hydroxide and sodium nitrate leave a durable black oxide coating on the steel. After the chemical bluing process, I apply a hard wax coating to give it one extra layer of protection against moisture and corrosion. In the days that it took me to do the koftgari and blacken the fittings, the tung oil on the handle has cured, and now it's time to inlay the silver wire. I needed a slightly finer gauge wire than I had on hand, so I drew it through my draw plate to get it down to the right size. The drawing process work hardens the sterling silver, so I need to anneal it or re-soften it. To anneal it, I heat the wire in a metal container, which helps speed up the process, as well as reduce the risk of melting part of the wire with a hot flame. Once the wire cools off, it's soft and ready to twist. Twisting wire is a somewhat mesmerizing process, and it's pretty easy to do with one end chucked in a drill or a Fordham flex shaft in this case, and the other end clamped in a vise. Once the wire is sufficiently twisted, then it's ready for inlay. I secure the end of each wire in a hole at the end of the handle, using the tip of a bamboo toothpick as a wedge. The tension in each wire should keep it firmly in its groove. Once all 6 wires are firmly in place, then it's time for final assembly.
Because I'm making this dagger a takedown construction, I don't need to use any glue. I just need to screw it all together. I'll make sure to wax the interior portions just so that if moisture happens to get in there, it doesn't rust anything. But other than a little bit of wax, it should all just screw right together, and the dagger is basically done. All right, so I got the guard on. So you have one little dot there. The dot goes toward the shell. On that spacer goes. This one also has a dot at the back. The dot also goes toward the shell. So it fits on properly. And then this just screws right on. Fairly simple construction.